Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to focus upon the concept of war and what we can do to avoid it. My guest is an expert on this topic. My guest today is Mr. David Swanson. David Swanson is an author, activist, journalist, and radio host. He's also the executive director of worldbeyondwar.org and campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. His latest book is titled NATO, What You Need to Know. David Swanson, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Hi, Bill. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. David, let's jump right into it. We'll start off with the easy ones first. What is worldbeyondwar.org?
It's an organization, a movement, a group of people with chapters around the world and people who've signed a statement around the world saying they want to work to end all war. And it does educational work and it does activism. We do online courses and books and videos, and we do meetings and lobby visits and blocking trains full of weapons and everything else you can imagine.
Yeah, it sounds like a full agenda there. You've got quite a bit
until war is abolished.
That's right. Golly, we need to move it. Yeah, we certainly do. Well, great. Well, our viewers can tap into the website at worldbeyondwar.org. Now, what about rootsaction.org? What is it about?
That is another place I work that is a US-based, online-based activist organization and educational organization that works on a wide array of issues, including peace, but including healthcare and trade and human welfare and environment and everything imaginable.
Very good. And again, the viewers can go to rootsaction.org to get more information. Well, let's talk about your book. What is it about NATO? What do we need to know?
Well, unlike I think all my other books, I co-wrote this book with a wonderful author named Medea Benjamin, and the two of us thought it important for people to learn a little something about NATO. It's increasingly in the news. They're going to be celebrating 75 years of NATO in Washington, D.C. in July. And we are going to be organizing events to say maybe there's a better way than NATO. For that, the website is nonatoyespeace.org, nonatoyespeace.org. But we thought it important for people to understand that NATO isn't a country, that NATO isn't an international organization, that NATO isn't the United Nations or the International Court of Justice, that when NATO publicly lobbies the United States government to allow weapons given to Ukraine to be shot into Russia, this is a Frankenstein monster. You know, NATO has been a puppet of the United States, disguised as a puppet of a dozen or 2 dozen, and now it's many dozen with partners around the world. Nations, but NATO is now taking on a role as not only the world's top weapons dealer, but an international forum advancing agendas from militarism to economics and politics and research and science. And nobody elects or holds accountable a single person in NATO. It's not a democratic institution, and yet it's almost 3/4 of the world's militarism, and it's very pro-militarism, publicly lobbying governments to spend more money on weapons. And there is a better way.
I'm glad you said that. What is the better way?
Well, the better way is not mad, self-destructive arms races with no end other than nuclear apocalypse, right? The better way is not nations so afraid of Russia that they join NATO, which is exactly what drives Russians in being afraid of the West. And this vicious cycle escalates, and with NATO and its leading members opposing any negotiations, you're left with escalation until nuclear apocalypse, which is not the acceptable answer. So the preferable alternative is to start engaging in negotiations and diplomacy and investment in human and environmental needs and the crises that we don't have a choice about, and scaling back and supporting international courts and supporting international treaties and supporting and reinstating disarmament agreements, and prioritizing survival.
Now, as we look at the situation in Europe right now and look at, focus on Ukraine, what would the situation be like in Ukraine if NATO were not there, not involved, or what was NATO's involvement leading up to the Russian invasion of a sovereign country, namely Ukraine? So what could have been done differently, and what can be done differently to defuse this problem?
Well, first of all, we're talking about a war, therefore everyone nearly loses their mind. And the minute I say something negative about NATO, I will be believed to have declared Russia blameless, innocent, angelic, and a force for moral harmony in the world. Russia is engaged in mass murder. It is not acceptable. It is criminal. It is outrageous. Amazingly, that doesn't make NATO an angelic savior of the world with good in its heart and rainbows shooting out its other orifices. It's a problem of imperial desires by people both in the West, or what's thought of the West minus Russia, and in Russia. And I don't know what the world would be like without NATO. It's NATO's expansion that blocked an ending of the Cold War. It's NATO's expansion that top NATO members themselves and US officials and the guy who's now the CIA director said would push Russia toward a war in Ukraine. You have, people in the US government or its environs like the Rand Corporation that wrote reports. Here's what we can do to get Russia into a war in Ukraine. Without that intentional, knowing drive to create this war, I don't know if you would have this war. And without the Russian insanity of let's oppose NATO by doing what everybody knows will be the biggest boost to NATO ever, I don't think you could have this war. Right? I mean, didn't Russia know Finland and Sweden and these countries would love NATO as soon as Russia fought against NATO in this backward, barbaric sense of the only way you can fight?
That's the irony. Well, there are many ironies involved in this whole Russian-Ukrainian war, as we put it. And the craziest thing was that really before Russia invaded full force a little over 2 years ago, NATO was kind of stumbling around trying to figure out what to do, sort of falling apart, to be quite honest. And they weren't quite too sure. Well, as soon as Russia did that, that became a galvanizing point and brought the NATO members together. Joe Biden was very instrumental in pulling them together to confront the Russians. But we're stuck with this situation, and looking in the rearview mirror is great to help us avoid it in the future. But what can we do to get the Russian, first off, as I view it anyway, and the United Nations and most other international folks see it as an invasion of a sovereign country by Russia. What can we do to get Russia and Ukraine to pause this war, to bring it to a halt, and to actually sit down and to negotiate and to work it out without doing it on the battlefield?
Well, Russia has invaded a sovereign country in a very, very different way from how it invaded and seized Crimea, which for years was the greatest crime of the century, never mind Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., where nobody disputes that the people of Crimea were going to vote to join Russia, no matter what Russia did, no matter if it didn't have troops on the streets. But sending troops and tanks and bombs and missiles into Ukraine, this is the greatest crime there is, right? But the point is not the madness of imagining you're going to overthrow the Russian government and survive it, or the Russian madness of imagining you're going to overthrow the Ukrainian government and survive it. The point is negotiate an end. And it's hard to hold Russian criminals accountable if Ukrainian criminals have absolute immunity, and if the United States is doing everything it can to tear down the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court because there are some people there who don't think Israel should have complete immunity. And so you've got to negotiate a peace without that sort of law enforcement that people on both sides fantasize being applied exclusively to the other. Unless everybody's going to agree to make it universal, it's not going to work. So what do? You negotiate an end with measures that both sides find make a better deal than continuing the slaughter. And Russia, a month in Turkey, said, if Ukraine won't join NATO, we'll get out. And NATO said, heck no, we want a war. And this has been the problem. Now Russia says, let us have Eastern Ukraine, which we've taken over, and we won't fight anymore, and we won't want anything else. And NATO still says, and of course it's a worse deal than they could have had years ago, or they could have had before the invasion if they had just taken the Minsk agreement seriously. They still say no. But, neither side is going to get as good a deal late in a war as they could have had earlier in a war. This is a problem with wars. But ending it is preferable to everybody dying, and not just our species, taking the rest of the species with us. Ending it is preferable. The peace agreements that have been proposed for years now, month after month, from Latin America, from South Africa, from China, from the Pope, there's huge overlap. It's not rocket science. Everybody knows what's needed. What's needed is a degree of neutrality, a degree of demilitarization, both sides agreeing that Ukraine won't be a pawn in an eternal battle against the other. This is what's needed, and people have to sit down and do it. And it's not helped by everybody screaming for war and vengeance and hatred of the crimes of the other side.
Very true. No doubt about that. That's quite true. Well, we're going to take a brief break, and we're going to come back and talk about the whole geostrategic arrangement that exists in Europe right now and what could be in the future, and also talk about the military-industrial complex. But you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at the whole concept of war and what we can do to avoid it and to make it something that's not even on the drawing board in the future. My guest is an expert on this topic. David Swanson is an author, activist, journalist, and radio host. He is executive director of worldbeyondwar.org and campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. His latest book is NATO, What You Need to Know. David, you made some really important points. And I personally, I think both sides, even Putin, who won't admit it, I think he'd be more than willing to stop the war if he could at this point. Zelensky, probably, maybe, but he doesn't want to give up what Russia has taken of Ukraine at this point. But there have been a lot of interesting proposals that have come up, and you talked about some of the peace proposals. And that brings up, how do we learn more about these peace proposals? What role does the media play, and what role have the media played in discussing this war, presenting it, I'm not going to say in an objective fashion, because the U.S. media, generally speaking, is not very objective, in my opinion. But anyway, what role can they play and what role have they played?
Well, the media could play a dramatic role, and many good media outlets do. But major corporate media outlets and government media outlets tend not to be open to things that oppose their interests. And so just about nobody knows the history of Ukraine and Russia. Just about nobody knows the history of Ukraine post-Soviet Union, of the fact that the people of Ukraine overwhelmingly didn't want to be part of NATO or Europe or Russia, wanted to be neutral, wanted to be independent, of the openly backed U.S. supported coup in Ukraine in 2014, of the fighting that went on between Ukraine and its eastern provinces ever since 2014, of the admissions by European governments in France and Germany that the Minsk II agreements were a fraud, that they never meant to allow those eastern provinces some degree of autonomy and make Ukraine the sort of neutral place that wouldn't disturb Russia or the West, but would leave both alone. That there was never any desire for this, much less has U.S. media ever told anyone in the U.S. The role of the U.S. and the U.K. and NATO in blocking negotiations that could have ended this war a month in and several months in and just recently, and the continued stance of opposing negotiating an end to the war. Well, you hypothesize that Vladimir Putin and the Russian government might be open to ending the war. The Russian government are publicly declaring that they want to end the war. They just want to end it now with the bit of territory they've taken, rather than the earlier offer just prior to the invasion and just after the invasion of getting out entirely and ending the war with merely a commitment not to join NATO. This is the sticking point. It's not freedom. It's not democracy. It's not our beloved values of funding genocides in Palestine or any of it. It's NATO. If the US and NATO were willing to say, no, we're okay without Ukraine joining, it would, this is the biggest sticking point, and they won't move on it. Much less will the media tell you about steps toward compromise and disarmament and agreement, and what unarmed civilian defense is, and what alternatives there are to organized killing.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly there's a lot of misinformation out there, and there's a lot of information that doesn't get out into the public. And it's important that we learn more about it. And of course, people can go to your websites and other sources of information to try to identify what exactly is happening. Well, one other hot spot that, again, is already underway, and it seems like everybody, or almost everybody, wants it to end, and that's the Israeli-Gaza war, the Israeli-Hamas war, I should say. What could be done to defuse that particular situation and bring some type of, at least a pause in the fighting, so that the relief aid can get in, so there can be some rebuilding, that the refugees can move back into their homes, or what's left of their homes, the ones that aren't in rubble. What can be done in that particular setting?
Well, I know you, Bill, and pretty much every living human knows the answer to that question. You stop providing the weapons. It's hard to use weapons if you don't have weapons. And it's hard to end wars by providing free, unlimited weapons of mass murder and wishing the wars would end. Doesn't work in Ukraine, doesn't work in Palestine, has failed dramatically for decades. Here, have unlimited weapons, kill who you want with them. I wish you would end the war. This is US policy that isn't just stupid, it's dishonest. People don't believe that anyone is stupid enough to mean it sincerely. They know they're being lied to, and this turns people off even more than stupidity or senility. Is being lied to by governments that claim they're trying to end a war. They're working for a ceasefire. They're frustrated in their efforts to end the war while providing endless weapons that actually aren't free. You and I pay for them. The people who live in the countries providing the weapons, overwhelmingly the United States, pay for them. And it's, it's not a difficult thing. You just stop violating 10 or 12 laws and stop sending them.
The recent proposal put forth by the Biden administration to have a ceasefire immediately, to have the Israeli troops withdraw, to do a variety of other things that most people be in favor of, Benjamin Netanyahu is not in favor of. But do you think that Joe Biden, who's really been in an interesting position, do you think he actually went to Netanyahu and read the riot act to him and say, look, we're going to cut, we're not going to provide you with arms. Oh, by the way, we may not even veto any more of your resolutions at the United Nations General Security Council. Do you think he strong-armed him on this? But Netanyahu has said, and Netanyahu can't give it up. If he does, he will go to jail in all probability. But what do you think happened on that proposal? How do you view it?
I think, although I don't care much, that President Biden has probably said very stern things to Prime Minister Netanyahu that haven't included, I'm ever going to stop sending you weapons. And I think Netanyahu has cared even less than I do what those words have been out of President Biden's mouth, so long as they have not included, I'm going to stop sending you weapons. It just doesn't make any sense. If I were shooting up my neighbor's house and the local city council was bringing me trucks full of bullets so that I could keep the shooting going, and they said to me, we seriously wish you would end this conflict someday. Here's some more bullets. Here, have some more wheelbarrows full of bullets. Like, why would I, as this murderous madman, care what the words were that were accompanying the bullets? It just doesn't make any sense. And if I, threw some crackers through the window after I shot up everybody in that room, would I deserve the world's praise? Would it now be a humanitarian operation? This is what the media can do to you. It can make you imagine that these nonsensical things are serious. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, you're certainly right, and especially about some of the media people too. The for-profit media, so many of them are the biggest flag wavers for intervention and actually engaging in conflict. And of course, a large part of that is because of the military-industrial complex. Now, I'm hearing people, observers of the whole situation, describe it as the military, industrial, academic, congressional complex that's out there, the one that Eisenhower warned us against back in the late 50s. And they're talking about how this whole complex is basically a war machine working on behalf of companies like Raytheon, Boeing, different ones like that. How do you see the expansion of that military industrial complex?
It's beyond anything Eisenhower's nightmares could have included. I mean, we're far gone. We're not approaching spiritual death, as Dr. King said a country must be if it continues to invest more in militarism than in human needs. We're gone. We're beyond the grave. It's out of control, and it's taken over U.S. society in a way that Eisenhower outlined in his prediction. Right? You look at these college campuses where many of these universities could make tuition absolutely free for every student and not lose as much money as they would if they cut off their relationship with the military, that have more money invested in weapons than they do in education, that take more money from the Pentagon than they do from students. And so people are shocked at how they could care less what their students and teachers think than what their endless supply of administrators who've proliferated like generals in the Pentagon tell them to do out of financial interest. And they violently attack peaceful students protesting genocide, of all things, on campuses. Because they are part of the military industrial complex. It's taking over city and county and state economies, and it's a horribly, insidiously destructive force.
It certainly is, no doubt about it. And of course, Congress plays a critical role in this. And we see, well, look at the recent defense budget, and you never talk about the defense budget without saying the bloated defense budget. Those three words go together automatically. It's just like jam and peanut butter or something. But anyway, the point is that they are actually, they have so much money now, close to what, $900 billion. And that's just on the surface. There are many other costs. And we have, I think internationally, it's like $2 trillion, the international arms race. And what could be done with that money, or part of it, if not all of it, but certainly part of it, to help rebuild our educational system, the healthcare system, the infrastructure in this country and around the world. But so many things positive could be done with that money. But we've got interests who are pushing it, and they make money off it. That's exactly as, I think it was Bill Clinton years ago, he said, follow the money, and it will take you to where you want to be. Well, unfortunately, David, we're down to about our last 30 seconds. What advice or what suggestions would you have for our viewers as they view this whole situation of war?
Well, remember that Bill Clinton followed the money into expanding NATO eastward for weapons deals in Eastern Europe and should have listened to his wiser self. And remember that it isn't bloated if it needs to be abolished. Any military budget is the problem, and we shouldn't call it defense unless it does something defensive, or we're paid some of that money to call it defense, as so many people are. We should call it the military budget that needs to be abolished. And tiny fractions of it could transform our world for the better. Don't let anybody tell you about any useful endeavor that there isn't enough money. It is always a lie. The billionaires have it, and the military has it, and it is sloshing around in unprecedented tidal waves of cash. It's just concentrated in those two interlocking places, the very wealthy and the military industrial complex, or the Mickey Mat, as Ray McGovern likes to call it. You can figure out what all those letters stand for.
That's the acronym of the day. That's exactly right. Yeah. Well, it's very accurate what you just said. And of course, it's very disheartening to hear members of Congress like Senator Tuberville talking about trying to increase the defense, what they call the defense budget, and amplify it even more. Well, David Swanson, this is a very important topic, and it's one that we all need to learn so much more about. But I want to thank you so much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.